Triangle. My name is Stephen Horn. I'm an independent journalist here in North Carolina. Let's talk about some local news over the past week. Starting off in Durham County. So the question is, Durham County, is it a sanctuary jurisdiction? The local officials say no, but facts and the Department of Homeland Security say yes. So in a now deleted list of sanctuary jurisdictions, the Department of Homeland Security named Durham as one of 5 North Carolina counties accused of, quote, deliberately obstructing the enforcement of federal immigration laws and endangering American citizens. So the county of Durham actually responded to this with the Board of Commissioners and the Sheriff's Office releasing a statement to refute the accusation, saying that the county has never adopted any ordinance, resolution, policy, or proclamation declaring itself a sanctuary jurisdiction, and that it, quote, does not have any policies, procedures, nor engage in any practices that would impede cooperation with immigration enforcement or limit compliance with detainer requests. Now, what the county is saying here might be technically true, but if we look at what is actually meant by the word sanctuary jurisdictions, it refers to jurisdictions that are not cooperating with enforcing federal law. It doesn't mean that they're violating federal law necessarily. It's about whether they are cooperating to enforce federal law. And if we look back at some of the evidence, we can see that Sheriff Clarence Burkhead of Durham ran on a platform of limiting their cooperation with ICE. There's a 2018 article in Indy titled Durham County's Friendly Relationship with ICE Could Hinge on Its Sheriff's Re-Election Bid. So the sheriff at the time, Mike Andrews, under his leadership, the Durham County Detention Facility, the jail, they would honor all ICE detainers. So if ICE asked them to detain an illegal immigrant after they would be released so that ICE could come pick them up, the Durham jail would comply. And Burkhead ran on a policy of changing that. And what did he do when he won the election with over 90% of the vote in the Democratic primary over Andrews? Well, he did exactly what he promised that he would do. And that is documented on his website. Quote, one of Sheriff Burkhead's first directives in office was to halt the policy of holding detainees past the time when they legally should be released. Durham County Sheriff's Office continues to make legally required notifications of federal officials while making detainees available to national law enforcement. So what that means is that Burkhead did exactly what he said he would, which is that he would only hand detainees over to immigration when explicitly required to by federal law. So that was limiting the level of cooperation. And that is exactly what is meant by sanctuary jurisdictions. It means the jurisdiction is not doing they're not exercising any of their discretion in helping federal law enforcement enforce federal laws, because generally local departments are not required to use any of their resources to assist federal law enforcement. And that's the question with immigration is, do they do it willingly? And what we can see from the evidence here in Durham, continuing on Burkhead's website up till at least February 2025, is a statement true to his word. Sheriff Burkhead has rejected ICE detainers without a judicial warrant or a notice to appear. Detainers target marginalized communities. So basically what that means is that he will only honor detainers when he is ordered to by a court. So, most detainers are not judicial warrants, they're administrative warrants. Now, North Carolina did pass a law limiting the ability of sheriffs like Burkhead to not cooperate with ICE. There's a law passed in 2024, House Bill 10, which requires law enforcement, state and local law enforcement departments in North Carolina to honor detainers issued by ICE, even when they're not required to by federal law. Well, even with this legal requirement, we have seen sheriffs like Mecklenburg County Sheriff Gary McFadden get around this law, where ICE has complained that he is not giving them notifications. So the sheriff might be technically following the law by holding the detainees for an extra time period after when they would otherwise be released. But if ICE is not aware of when those 48 hours start, they don't know to come pick up the illegal alien. And so there's currently a bill being considered, House Bill 318, which would basically, sort of close that loophole so that the state and local departments, if they're holding a detainee on behalf of ICE, they have to notify ICE so that ICE has a chance to come pick them up. So this was an issue that was publicized in Mecklenburg County, where they're sort of getting around this this detainee requirement. So in terms of whether Durham County is currently operating as a sanctuary jurisdiction, that's more of a question, because once again, the North Carolina legislators did limit the discretion that local law enforcement can, have in their cooperation with ICE. But given that in the past, Burkhead has refused to do anything that he was not explicitly required to by law in cooperating with federal immigration efforts, we can assume that that is still the case. So even though the minimum level of cooperation has increased, we can safely assume that Burkhead is not going a single iota above that minimum level. So I would say, yes, Durham County definitely deserves to be on a list of sanctuary jurisdictions. It has previously been on a list put out by the Center for Immigration Studies, along with Chatham and Orange, which are the three counties in the Triangle, which were on DHS' latest list. What is interesting is that Wake County is not on that list, because Wake County was ranked number 18 nationwide for the number of deportable aliens released into the public, according to data that was obtained by the Center for Immigration Studies. So it's sort of interesting that the Wake County was not included on that list, despite being one of the top jurisdictions nationwide where they are not cooperating with ICE and basically releasing illegal aliens back into the community when they are done with their detention, which is kind of surprising to me. If we look in Wake County, there have been some notable crimes committed by illegal aliens recently, including a kidnapping of a couple where the mother and the baby were taken and then later released, and 3 illegal aliens were arrested for that. And a couple years ago, there was a murder of a Wake County deputy where 4 illegal aliens, siblings, all of them Mexican nationals, have been arrested and charged in relation to that murder of Wake County deputy Ned Bird. And despite that, Wake County has still continued operating as a sanctuary jurisdiction. So it's sort of surprising to me that Wake County did not make the DHS list. In our next story here, we have an update in the lawsuit against UNC Chapel Hill, a public records lawsuit over documents which may be related to the origins of COVID-19. So US Right to Know, this is a medical watchdog group. A couple years back, I believe it was in 2020, they began filing public records requests with the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill relating to Dr. Ralph Baric and the coronavirology, and specifically the communication with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where there is potentially information exchange, potentially discussion about coronavirus and gain-of-function research, which may have had some role or give some insight into what is apparently the lab leak of COVID-19, which resulted in the worldwide pandemic. So the UNC refused to turn over certain documents, citing a research exemption in the state's public records law. So US Right to Know ended up filing a lawsuit, and last year a judge ended up siding with UNC in their interpretation of the statute. So US Right to Know has filed an appeal in the North Carolina Court of Appeals, and they have recently filed an appellant brief basically laying out their case for why the North Carolina Court of Appeals should overturn the lower court's ruling. And so basically they cite some precedent as to why the judge should not have accepted the broad interpretation of the exemption. One of the reasons is because there is previous rulings on the state's public records law that say, hey, the public records law should be interpreted as broadly as possible to give the public the most access to documents, and exemptions should be interpreted as narrowly as possible. And that does not appear to be what the judge in Orange County did. He accepted a broad interpretation for the exemption and a narrow interpretation for the documents which are available to the public. So this is an ongoing story I've covered here in the greater Triangle area, where the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill is. So I've previously covered this lawsuit, as well as recently we covered evidence regarding not the origins of COVID-19, but additional times that COVID-19 was apparently leaked into Chapel Hill by research that was going on at the university during the pandemic, because the University of Chapel Hill has some, I guess, internationally known coronavirus research going on with the infamous Dr. Ralph Baric. And for our next story here, we have a bit of cancel culture. So a uh, sort of a game and geek expo in Raleigh, sort of an event. And I'm not too familiar with this whole scene and this whole culture, but basically a NASCAR driver and YouTuber named Cody Dennison was canceled and invited at the last minute from this game and geek expo because of his content being too conservative or right leaning, and that would somehow violate the inclusivity of the event. And this is, didn't follow too much with what was it, Gamergate, but kind of vaguely looking from far away, this sort of culture, it's cancel culture around a lot of facially non-political events like this. We can see it continuing where, because they get complaints that there's right-wing content for in some of this guy's streams, that now he's not invited to the event, uninvited at the last minute. And apparently he says he has spent over $700 on unique merch for this event. So, that's kind of, definitely unfortunate. And it kind of shows how these events are often at the whim of, basically the loudest tiny minority who will get upset at anything. And our next story here we have from the Chapel Hill Carborough City Schools District. So on Thursday, there were 2 walkouts at 2 different high schools in the district, and apparently these 2 walkouts were for completely separate and completely unrelated reasons. So at Chapel Hill High School, they had 50 students walk out, protesting, quote, the intensification of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Protesting the situation in the Middle East, protesting Zionism or Israel or however they put it, wearing keffiyehs and whatnot. So the district has previously faced pushback from pro-Israel organizations like Voice for Israel, Unified Jewish Voices, and the Al-Jaminer. Not quite sure how to say it, because this is not the first pro-Palestine activism by students or related to the district. So there's a similar walkout last year, and there's also an anti-Israel display that was allowed to be put up in the Carborough High School library that was reported on. And the Carborough High School is actually where the second walkout happened on the same day, where about 80 students walked out of class, but apparently for a completely unrelated reason. Apparently it just happened to be on the same day, because there doesn't seem to be any connection between the two, because the purpose of this walkout was to protect the conditions at the school and the leadership, specifically of Principal Helena Thomas. So apparently there is a letter associated with a protest listing the concerns that was reported on by the News and Observer, and those include the lack of communication by the school district regarding issues such as bomb threats or tornado warnings. Apparently, there's been issues with male students spying on the female restroom at the school, hampering school resource officers from doing their job, and also inconsistent or unfairly applied discipline. So I don't know what all is going in there, but apparently it's serious enough that the students staged this protest, where apparently they're joined by some of the parents, and they walked about 2 miles to an administrative building. They did meet with the the district superintendent, who is controversial in her own ways for plagiarizing, I believe it was her dissertation, and we wrote an article about that a little while back. So those are the stories for this week. If you've been tuning in, thanks for listening, and see you next week.